I'm making sure that the curve of my cab corner matches the curve on the rocker, even with me tweaking it. You know, half of having to replace the door down here is kind of good. That way, whenever I do replace this section, I can match it perfectly to the rest of this. But this all looks pretty good, and if you can see, that back corner raised up real nice. So I am pretty happy with that. Okay, so left side is looking good, but right in here it's kind of bowed out. And remember, that's because I told you about the way they make these stamps. They make them to overlap, so that's why there's a little bit extra there. But if you look down the rest of the cab corner, it's actually pretty good, and our gap closed up. Let's see if you can see it back there, maybe. So what we're going to do is create a couple of slice cuts to kind of bend in the cab corner, and that's what you're going to see now. I've got the back end screwed in place, and you know, like I said, I'm going to worry about that last. Right now I'm just going to go ahead and tap these in to fit, and if it looks like there's too much, if I have to tap like this one, I might need to cut these a little bit more down to give it more length to spread that transition out, because you don't want any big differences, if that makes sense, over a short gap, because it'll be a lot more noticeable. So we'll just start with the first one and put it in place, which is actually already pretty close, and just work our way around. I'm using a combination of feel with my eyes, because your eyes can play tricks on you just as easily as your hands can. Trying to be very careful with the amount of heat I put in this panel. This next piece is moving pretty freely, so I don't really want to bend it. I'm going to try and use one of these panel clamps to see if I can just clamp it where I want it. But since it's such a sharp curve, that might be, and a small piece, that might not be feasible. Again, being real careful about the heat. And I'm not going to weld down these cuts yet, because depending on how this looks, once we get around that seam, we may want to cut these longer to make the transition look better. Because what would happen if you're trying to move the top up too much, you would end up with a big hump right here down in the middle at the end of your cuts, because if you think about it, your panel's bending over, and that's your access point, your point of rotation. So there might be a little hump there right along that line, and we don't want that. So we'll just see what we're looking like as we keep going. Now this is the same piece, but it's the other corner, and it doesn't want to. This one can do it. It's moving freely, but now that I've tacked the left corner, the right corner is kind of firm. So now we're going to switch back over to the hammers with super light taps. And what I'm doing is I'm actually using the tip to pinpoint and using the face to apply the pressure so I don't miss where I want to hit. Another little trick I use are little copper slips. This is just a piece of 1/2-inch pipe that I've bent the end down on. And if you put this behind a weld, it does two things. It acts as a heat sink, but it also helps your weld get hot and penetrate out, but not get too hot and burn through the metal. And it doesn't stick to it because it's a dissimilar metal. With the heat on a curve like this, you will tweak this thing out of control if you try and do too much at a time. As you can see, drastic improvements. It just takes slow, small steps. You want to wait till you can touch this without it feeling like you need to take your hand off of it before even thinking about putting another tack on this. So we're going to do the same thing. I don't want to bend it. It's moving. Let me just make sure you can see that. It's moving freely. So I'm going to use a panel clamp to get the left side where I want it, tack it, then tap over the right side. You want to use the lowest heat setting you possibly can when you're doing this, because at the moment you don't need to be super concerned with penetration. You just need to make sure it's going to stay where you want it, and when you go back and you start filling it in, stitch welding it, that's whenever you turn the heat up a little bit more. Going to do the same thing. It's firmed up, so I'll use the 2 hammers to tweak that in place. What I was doing there was cleaning off the burrs so I could really see the curve. And there's not a noticeable hump right here. And just high build epoxy primer will contour that out nicely. But the bigger change, or the bigger gap that we had to fill, was up around this area. So we might see a little hump in here, and we might have to cut those notches down farther to get that big hump out of there. Not sure if you can see it, but that's just a glob of filler on the top side. I don't even think it's touching the bottom. And that's what I do first. And then the second time I pull the trigger, I aim for that glob and it melts it down onto the bottom one. next thing I'm doing. It's just going to do a few of these plug welds. Since I painted it after drilling the holes, I just took the drill bit and lightly touched in the hole and kind of created a bare metal spot for me to actually make contact to. Now I'm gonna clean off a little bit of the paint on a few of these. I'm not gonna do it all now. I'll wait to fill in all the plug weld once I finish everything up and go ahead and burn in the rest of the cab corner. So that's what we're looking like. That is pretty darn good. As far as how everything lines up, it's looking pretty decent. Show you from the side here. See. Tell. So that's basically looking down the side of the truck. Scoot you over a little bit more. So it's pretty flush right here. I mean, it's the most filler it's going to take to get that transition perfectly even around this curve is maybe a 1/16 of an inch in one spot. But we haven't finished with the outer rocker. This is before we've done anything to the outer rocker, so that's pretty good. Along this edge is going to take some tweaking, just like it did on the other side. Pretty typical. So for the most part, and for all intents and purposes, the cab corner is in its final resting place. Once we get everything wrapped up, and possibly whenever I start working on the outer door skin, is when I might tweak this curve on the cab corner, but it doesn't look likely because the curve actually looks really good. So, plan is once I get this welded in, get some tacks up down where the floor comes down, you put some tacks there, plug welds, if you will. I'm going to put a bolt in the cab corner right there and a bolt in that part of the other cab corner, and I plan to actually cut all this out and replace it. There's a website that sells that already bent. I am the one who sent them a section of my cab to base them off of. So they previously made an older generation pinch panel, and they thought it was good for 67 to 72. I bought it. Turns out they didn't realize it wasn't, so I sent them part of my cab, and in return they sent me the pinch seam panel, and it comes up to this edge. So at any rate, that is the pillar and cab corner hard part is finished. The rest is just touch-up work, and we will continue on to the outer rocker.